you for coming. It's always a pleasure for me to come down here to the library. I get here early so I can always read, and then I have the opportunity to talk with you, and then I go home. I live in Syracuse, New York. So before I start my conversation, how do you move this? This one?
Right, yeah.
Okay. Let me tell you a couple of things to have you understand what I'm going to say. This is the Caribbean. The Caribbean is the area where my family from the father's and from the mother's side has lived for more than 200 years. On the father's side, I'm from Puerto Rican heritage. On the mother's side, I'm from Cuban heritage. And I even have a very far away ancestor who comes from the Dominican Republic. So I was initiated in the Grand Lodge of Cuba. I currently also am a dual member with the Lodge of La Logia Soberana in Puerto Rico. I have been twice Fulbright in the Dominican Republic, where I have many friends and many brothers. And so I would like to dedicate my talk to the Grand Lodge of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic, and to my brother Masons. Masonry in the Caribbean is very different than Masonry in the United States. Physically, as well as from a point of view of some of its ideas. This, as you know, is an apron from a Blue Lodge. This is my apron. This is the apron that we use in the Grand Lodge of Cuba, that we use in la Gran Logia Soberana. It's the same apron that we use in la Gran Logia Nacional de la República Dominicana. It's red. When I first came to this country and they talked to me about the Blue Lodges, honest to God, I didn't know what they were talking about, because I had never seen a Blue Lodge in my life. Our lodges are red, like our aprons are red. And so I didn't understand. Then also, there are some things. This is a little paper that I wrote about the Freemasonry. I'm going to get a couple of things here. I'm going to translate because this is in Spanish. There's always been a duality in the practice of Freemasonry. Andreas Onefors, who's a Freemason, and he's an author of a book, they call him activist and introspective. The American lodges and the English lodges are more introspective. We try to make good men better and change society by moving one person at a time. So they apply the introspective principle with a lot of rigor, even though in the United States there are also people who are activists. But Mark Tabbert, who wrote a book about Freemasonry, he's in Washington, D.C., in the Washington Masonic Memorial, and he's a scholar there. He says that the Rotary and the Kiwanis were created by the American Freemasons, because they are introspective, and some Masons wanted to do things that they couldn't do in the lodge because they were considered political. In the Antilles, in the Antilles, it's the other way around. We are more activists. The Grand Lodge of Cuba, the Grand Lodge of Puerto Rico, and even in the Grand Lodge of República Dominicana, we say La Masonería. Freemasonry is the institution of morality. Its objective is to dissipate ignorance, combat vice, and inspire love to humanity. So if you want to combat ignorance and vice, you are a combative organization, not too much contemplative. And as you will see, when Freemasonry started in the Caribbean, it was pretty combative. We do have a difference between the political principles and the political activism. In the United States, or in English, you have policy and politics, which are very well distinguished. in Spanish, la política activa y la política, active politics and conceptual things. There is a paper, excellent paper in Ars Quattro Coronatorum, which is a journal from the English Lodge of Research, about this business of policy and politics in Lodge. And Powell, who's the author, says, social organizations like Freemasonry are a product of its media. And I wanted to read this because it's a product of its media. We in the Caribbean are Latin Americans. We are not Anglo-Saxons. So there is there's no surprise that our Freemasonry might be a little different, because we are also a little different. Our Freemasonry started being politically very active. And also the last difference between Freemasonry in Cuba and the Antilles and in Spain is that in Europe they have the concept of obedience, and obedience is a pyramidal structure that is top down. In the Americas, lodges are independent from the Supreme Council, and they govern themselves independently. The lodges have a Grand Master who's elected, not appointed, as they are in Spain by the Soberano Gran Comendador, and he says, and appoints, and dismisses, and everybody. So that said, I wanted to explain that, because otherwise, I don't think you would understand what I want to tell you here. This is the outline. I am going to talk a little bit about the anecdotic events in the 18th century. In the 1700s, in the United States, Freemasonry existed. And in 1776, when this country went into war with England for independence, George Washington was a Mason. Franklin was a Mason. The guy with the lamp in Boston, Paul Revere was a Mason. Livingston was a Mason. And this was the 1700s. In the 1700s, there was nothing in the Caribbean. Freemasonry was forbidden in Spain, and therefore it was forbidden in its colonies. In the 1800s, Freemasonry entered because it was a fallout from the Haitian Revolution. And that was what created the Freemason, because with the slave revolt in Haiti, then the French moved to the two neighboring islands, and they took their Freemasonry with them. After that, we had the Spanish, the French invaded Spain, the colonies became, they had juntas, which means councils, and those councils at some point decided, what do we need Spain here for? And they got rid of the Spaniards, and then the Freemasonry reappeared. They reappeared in the Dominican Republic, they reappeared in Cuba, they reappeared in Puerto Rico. They were somewhat different from each other. I am going to do a concentration in the 19th century, because that's the golden period of Freemasonry in the Caribbean. Okay. Freemasonry was forbidden in Spain, therefore it was forbidden in the colonies. There's no Freemasonry whatsoever in the 1700s anywhere in the colonies or in the mother country or European Spain. In 1771-74, the Grand Lodge of England made a theoretical provisional Grand Master position for Cuba and Latin America, which never had any connotation. In 1762, in the 7-Year War, which in the United States is known as the French and Indian War, the English attacked and took Havana. And they had the military lodges. In one of those military lodges, there was an Irish guy who was raised a Mason. There was no Cuban associated with that. That is another anecdote that has absolutely nothing to do with that. What has to do with that, may I have the map, please? Okay. We have to go a little bit back to the French Revolution. The French encyclopedists, of which some of them were Masons, like Voltaire, for example, came up with all these ideas about liberty and freedom and equality and all that stuff. And they did the French Revolution. And in Haiti, which is here, this was the richest colony that the French had in America. It had 500,000 people in there. 90% of the people that lived in Haiti at that time, of the 500,000, 90% were African slaves. The other 10%, half of them were Africans who had managed to become free and mixed race, like Pétion and all the other generals, and the other half were the white people, which were the masters and which were the artisans and so on and so on. So the free black men decided that we also want to be part of the French Revolution. And the white guys said, oh no, forget about it. And they revolted, they were more, and they kicked all the white French eyes, and these guys, they went to Cuba, they went to Puerto Rico, and they went a little bit to the Dominican Republic, because the Dominican Republic was involved in the war. They were invaded by the English, they were invaded by the Spaniards, they were invaded by the troops of Toussaint Louverture, and it was the terrible mess of people. That's where my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, who lived in the Dominican Republic at that time, moved to Puerto Rico. Okay, he wanted to get rid of it. So that was the story. Can I have the PowerPoint again, please? Okay, so in 1789 there were close to 40 lodges, half of which were in Haiti. They depended on the Grand Orient of France, and there was a guy there, a French guy called Etienne Morin, who came to Haiti and founded a lodge in Cap Haitien, or at that time it was Cap Français, and he created a rite of perfection. And then he moved into Jamaica. I'm talking about in the 1760s, 1766. He moved to Jamaica and became friends with this guy Franco, who was also a French citizen he became French citizen by paperwork. And he moved, but he was really a Dutch. He moved to New York State, which had a lot of Dutch population in upstate New York, and created a Lodge of Perfection in Albany, which has a lot to do with the development of the Scottish Rite in the United States. So the slave revolt in 1970, most of the lodges were closed, or they moved to Cuba and Puerto Rico, and some of them perhaps to the Dominican Republic. A provincial Grand Lodge was created in Haiti under by there was a class of black men like Pétion, like Boyer, who had been educated, who were in France, who came to Haiti with General Leclerc, who was the brother-in-law of Napoleon, and they were supposed to put their Haitians on their knees and make them slaves again. They lost. They had to go away, and that's when the Provincial Grand Lodge became there. This is Jean-Pierre. He was the president of Haiti when Haiti was divided into North and South. This is extremely important because this was the force that forced all these people out of there and created Freemasonry in the other islands, which then created Freemasonry in the United States, believe it or not. You will see how. Now, this guy invaded the Dominican Republic, and for 22 years, Dominican Republic was part of Haiti, because they were really, the Haitians were really terribly afraid that the Europeans, especially the French, would invade them again. It was a very bad example in the 805, 810, that there was a black independent republic in a continent where everybody else who was black was either slave or was recently freed somehow, but still had a lower social status there. So this is Boyer, and he was the president at the time. The French lodges who were created in Cuba were La Perseverance and la Concorde in the city of Santiago de Cuba in 1798. La Amitié and la Magnifique Concorde in Havana. There are still two very important streets in Havana. The street Amistad and Concordia in old Havana, which take their names from those lodges. There was the Temple of the Two Teologals in Havana was founded in 1804. And I think you have some document that you wanted to show there, or that is displayed in the table somewhere, when this lodge was created. Joseph Cerno was the worshipful master. He later moved to New York and started granting higher degrees to the Scottish Rite. This guy created a split in the Masonic history of the New York State, which was not resolved until 1867, when the Cerno part of the Freemasons joined with the rest. Okay, and created the United Scottish Rite for the northern jurisdiction. There was another lodge called Reunion de Coeur in Santiago de Cuba in 1805, and then Antoine Bidault was the worshipful master, and he moved to New York City. But some of the people who have been members of the lodge in Albany, of the Lodge of Perfection in Albany, created some high degree Scottish Rite Masons who went down to Charleston and created what was later known as the Mother Council of the Scottish Rite in 801. Malco and all the others, Rastilly and all those guys. They had their degrees taken from one of the guys who was created a Mason in the Lodge of Perfection in Albany. Okay, and this guy Joseph Cerno gave the degrees of the Scottish Rite to Gates and and Gilda and Gilda Yates and some of the other Masons who belonged to the northern jurisdiction that was recognized by the southern jurisdiction. So here you have two guys who were from the Haiti, who went to Cuba, who from Cuba went to New York City, who created degrees and created havoc and all of that. Then Napoleon had the idea of invading Spain. Napoleon was invading everybody in Europe at the time. By the way, it was through Napoleon that Freemasonry entered Spain, because among the things that Napoleon did was to destroy the Inquisition, which was a terrible institution that was preventing Spain from developing into a modern nation. And then he introduced the Freemasonry in Spain. But then, of course, the Spaniards didn't want to be conquered by the French. They started the war against the French. They created juntas in Latin America. And those juntas eventually became independent. Okay. This is the chronological development of the lodges in Cuba and in Puerto Rico. I have first discussed an epoch between 1800 and 1814, because that was the time that the French from Haiti went to Cuba and founded lodges, and then that was the time when King Ferdinand VII was a captive of Napoleon, and Spain was trying to liberate itself from the French. So Cuba was without government, and there were some lodges in there. When our good friend Ferdinand VII became king again in Spain, the first thing he did was to forbid Freemasonry. And so all these things disappeared. So the same thing happened in Puerto Rico. The French immigrants created lodges in San Juan, in San Germán, in Ponce, the biggest cities at the time. So the Bonapartists arrived in Spain under the French occupation, but after 1814, everything is gone. Ferdinand VII is again reinstalling all the old ways, and que vivan las caenas, which means hurrah with the chains. We want the chains, and that's what the king's people used to cry in their war cry. And then in 1820, they created a big army in Spain to send to Americas to fight Bolivar and San Martin and the people who were becoming independent. And guess what? The army who was in Cadiz revolted against the king and created a constitution. And we had what is called el trienio liberal, which is the 3 years of liberal government. Then we had a constitution, and we had a constitutional government. Freemasonry again flourished in Spain. Riego was said to be a Mason. It's not clear whether he was or he was not. But Freemasonry was all over the place in Spain, and it came back in Cuba. We had two Grand Lodges, Gran Logia Española de York, and we had Gran Oriente Territorial Español. One of them came from the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, the other one came from the Grand Orient of France. In Puerto Rico, they had also a Rose-Croix chapter in San Germán, which came from the Grand Lodge of New York. Grand Lodge of New York has been very helpful with lodges in Cuba and Puerto Rico, as you will see later on. So in 1824, the French invaded to kick out the revolutionaries, let's call it somehow, and put back the king. And there went Freemasonry, and that was the end of it until the 1850s, because of that, no one. In the Dominican Republic, things were a little bit different. As I said, the three Antilles were very poor colonies. If you had been Spaniards in the 1700s and were moving to America, where would you go? To Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, where there was absolutely nothing? Or you would go to Peru, where there was gold? You would go to Mexico, where there was silver? You would go to Bolivia and Colombia, where there were stones, precious stones. So nobody was going to Cuba. Nobody was going to the Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico. There were very stagnant colonies. And when there was a revolt in Haiti, which was the sugar bowl of Europe at that time, then the Spaniards said, you know what, we're going to take these islands and make them the new sugar bowl. Now, the thing to take into consideration in the Dominican Republic, in the year 1800, there were 500,000 people in Haiti, of which more than 400,000 were black slaves, who lived on the average 7 to 8 years. And then they brought some more. It's sad to say, if you had a company of lorries and you had your tires, you'd say, well, my tires last 50,000 miles. When they are, I'll throw them away and buy another. That was the psychology that they used for that. In Dominican Republic, because the Spaniards were poorer, they had very few slaves. Usually the owners lived in the countryside with their slaves. They took very good care of them, because if that slave died, they didn't have any money to buy any new one. In many cases, for some reason, there was a very more possibilities of black slaves to become free under Spain than under the British or the French. And so in the Dominican Republic, in Cuba and Puerto Rico, there were 3 tiers of people. There were the whites and the descendants of the white Spaniards who came there. There were a mixed population and black population who were free, and they were artisans and small farmers and things like that. And then there were slaves. The proof of the pudding is when the Haitians kicked out the French. Those who did not move fast enough were exterminated. There were no French left in Haiti after the revolution. When they moved and occupied Santo Domingo, there was not a single killing. The 2 people lived together in peace. The Haitians governed. If you go to the city of Santo Domingo, you will see El Palacio Borgelat, which is one of the big colonial structures. There were no other, because the French, Ferrand and Rochambeau, were 2 French generals who invaded because they wanted to destroy the Haitian Revolution. They couldn't, they left. In 1809, they decided they had nothing back here. they just told the Spaniards, you get your island back, we don't want it, there's nothing we can do with it. And the Spaniards, this is an epoch from 1809 to 1820 called España Boba, which means the fool Spain, foolish Spain. Because Spain had nothing there. It sent no soldiers, it sent no money, there was nothing. And the governor, Núñez de Cáceres, he was a Freemason. And he decided that he wanted to make the government independent and then joined Gran Colombia. And the Haitians said, you know what, this guy becomes independent, the next thing that's going to happen is that the French are going to come back. So that's not going to happen. So they moved. There was a Haitian leader who became king, Henri Christophe, and he built a fortress in the highest hills called Citadelle La Filière, and that was, and he built fortress. They had this constant trouble. The French are coming back, the French are coming, and they had tried to come back to make them slave again, and it was a reality. They were freed slaves who had become independent. Boy, that was not a good example, and they knew it, and they knew that if they were not very clear, they would be wiped out. So they moved into the Dominican Republic, and Richer and Bourgelat were Masons, and they created the first lodge in Santo Domingo with the Haitian invasion. Out of this lodge, there was Juan Pablo Duarte, who was a Dominican. After 22 years of government, they started making laws by which, if you didn't know French, you couldn't be an officer of the government and things like that. So the guys who were in the Dominican Republic said enough is enough, and they threw out the Haitian government. And Juan Pablo Duarte, who was a Mason, created a para-Masonic organization called La Trinitaria, which was not a Masonic organization, but it was molded. And that was, at that time, done. The same thing was done was done in South America, in Argentina, and it was done in Venezuela. They created organizations which used passwords and touches and things like that. They were not really Masonic organizations, they used it. And then there is this character, Tomás Bobadilla, who started here. He started in the 1820s. He was a Dominican. He became a Mason in one of the Haitian lodges. And this guy is the creator of the first Dominican Grand Lodge in 1858. He created La Gran Logia Nacional Dominicana. This is, I have the pictures. Can you show them these pictures in big? In my, see this guy here? This is Petion, Alexander Petion. He was president. Bolivar, when he was kicked out of Colombia, went to Haiti, and Petion gave him money, gave him asylum, and said, when you go back and you free your country, the only thing I'm going to ask you is that you free my people, which he didn't. Then the other guy, this, no, that's Vicente, that comes later. No, this guy here, yeah, this is Bourgelat, this is Trichet. These are two generals from Haiti, and so we can go back to our slides. Okay, so these are three important guys. This was president of Haiti. When he died and Henri Christophe died, then Boyer became president, unified the country, took over the Dominican region, and created a single nation until 1844, that the Dominicans became independent. And became independent with Duarte, Mella, and Sanchez, and they created a new nation. Okay, in Cuba, the timeline from 1859 to 1855 is different. From 1830 to 1855 or something like that, forget about Freemasonry. It was again forbidden because the Spaniard didn't like it. It was very suspicious society. So, in 1859, the Supreme Grand Commander Albert Pike sends Brother Andrés Casar, and Brother Andrés Casar is a very interesting figure because Casar founded La Fraternidad, which is downstairs. I have a few members here. And he was from French origin, from Haiti, but he was born in Cuba. This is El Espejo Masónico, which is a book of his newspapers. He created a newspaper, and this is the rituals that he wrote in Spanish, because at that time there were not too many. So he was a scholar of Freemasonry, and he was sent to Cuba to create a Grand Lodge. So what he did is he went to Santiago de Cuba. There were 2 clandestine lodges functioning there. He created the third one. You needed 3 lodges to do a Grand Lodge. He created La Gran Logia de Colón, the Grand Lodge of Columbus, and he created the Supreme Council of Colombia, Supreme Council of Columbus. And then he used, and you will find in the volume 1 of the Red Book, he used the Naples Supreme Council capitulations paperwork, which was a disaster. There were problems with that. So that created a lot of problems because the Grand Lodge wanted to be independent, and the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge was a Cuban born. The Supreme Commander of the Scottish Rite was a Spaniard who was a count or a marquis or something like that. They didn't get along well. So they had a lot of struggles and a lot of problems. And Pike said, "I'm going to send somebody else." And he sent Antonio de Castro, who was a doctor. Now, Andrés Casar was a member of the lower middle class. He was a self-made man. He studied to become a teacher, and the Grand Master in Puerto Rico, Palmer, was also a self-made man. And De Castro, he was a man who had some means. He went to the university and became a medical doctor. He went to New Orleans, and New Orleans had a Supreme Council, had a Scottish Rite body who was independent of the body of Charleston, of the mother body. And then Pike somehow found a way of incorporating the Louisiana body into the mother council. He reissued the degrees to De Castro and then sent him to Cuba to fix some things. But Castro was I'm going to go out on a limb. I will say Andrés Casar was more of a Mason than a politician, and Castro was more of a politician than a Mason. He was very interested in doing the independence revolution. So he created the GOCA, Gran Orient of Cuba and the Antilles, el Gran Oriente de Cuba y las Antillas, of which he was the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge and the Supreme Commander. And it was mostly a very political organization. But it was a Freemason organization, okay? Because the paramasonic organizations that I mentioned before, like La Trinitaria, they were not Masonic organizations. They took some ideas like the handshakes and the words and things, but these guys were Masons. They had degrees like the Masons, and but they were very, very active in politics, and they established. Actually, the lodges in the province of Oriente had most of the most important generals of the Cuban First War of Independence, the president of the Republic of the Cuban. They were all Masons of those lodges. So then there was an internal struggle between these two lodges, the Lodge of Colón and the GOCA for the Masonic territory. And in 1868, which was just a few years after, the first Cuban War of Independence started. And the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Colón was murdered by the Spanish troops with his Grand Secretary, which might be a very dangerous position if things get bad. And there were several other Grand members of the Grand Lodge there, and they were all murdered because the Spaniards didn't like, they were very much afraid of the Masons, whether they were from the Goka or whether they were from the other. So in the 1870s, in the 1868, there was a revolution in Spain. They kicked out the Queen Isabella and they instaured a republic in Spain. And then Freemasonry came into the republic. But they didn't grant the autonomy or the independence to Cuba and Puerto Rico. We used to say in Cuba, the Spanish are liberal in the continent, but they are Spaniards in America. Los españoles son liberales en España, pero españoles en América. So in 1870s, this lodge, we call it autochthonous because they are the lodge of the Creoles as opposed to the Spaniard lords. And in 1880, they merged these two branches of the autochthonous lodges. They merged and created the Grand Lodge of Colón and Island of Cuba. And that lodge was the one who is responsible of creating a Gran Logia Soberana of Puerto Rico. So in the Dominican Republic, Tomás Bobadilla, as I said before, organized Gran Logia Nacional de República Dominicana in 1858. In 1860, Dominican Republic was always looking to get into a larger country. They were too small, they were afraid that they would be again invaded by Haiti. They tried to get into the Colombia Republic with Bolivar, they tried to get into France, they tried to get into Spain, but they actually got into Spain. They tried to get into the United States, and they struck a deal with Ulysses Grant, which was never materialized because it was not approved by the Senate. And so they were always trying to get into somebody. And in the 61 to 65, they became a province of Spain. And Spain had, in that time, the opportunity to create something which was really demanded by their Antillean colonies, which was an autonomous confederation of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and República Dominicana. If the Spaniards had the talent to have done that, they would have avoided the Spanish-American War. And they would still be a third or fourth level power, but they would have not had that disastrous defeat that they had in 1898. So in those years that Spain came back, Freemasonry again disappeared from the Dominican Republic. As soon as the Spaniards were kicked out, President Buenaventura Baez was a 33rd degree Mason. Very interestingly enough, many generals who fought for Cuban independence had fought on the Spanish side during the War of Restauración, including Máximo Gómez, Donato Marmor, etc. Very interesting how things work. Ulises Espaillat was also a president, and he was a Mason. Gregorio Luperón was a Mason. He was also a president and a general. Ulises Uro was a Mason, 33rd degree Mason, and he was president for 15 years of the Dominican Republic, and they were also generals of the War of Restauración. This is President Baez, Buenaventura Baez, and that is Bobadilla, who was Priol at that time. And he died in Haiti because he got it. But in Puerto Rico, what happened is they never went to war. They had a start of war. We had what we call El Grito de Yara in October of 1868. They had what they call El Grito de Lares in September of 1868. Cuba being larger, it was more difficult to get the rebels in Puerto Rico, so rebellion died in Puerto Rico. But the Spaniards then granted them more independence and more facilities. For example, Spaniards abolished the slavery in Puerto Rico in 1873. They did not abolish it in Cuba until 1880. And the Unión Germana was a lodge that depended from the Dominican Republic. It was extremely important because Santiago Palmer was raised there, Betances was raised there, Belvis was raised there. These were very important political leaders in Puerto Rico. Estrella de Luquillo was the first lodge created by the Grand Lodge of Cuba. When the Grand Lodge of Cuba was created, Pike gave them a charter that included Puerto Rico. So what Cuba did, Cuba and Puerto Rico had always been very, very close. What Cuba did is to try to foster the Grand Lodge in Puerto Rico and cut it loose, make it. This is a very, very unusual situation because England came here to America and created provincial lodges, but they never set them loose. The Americans had to become independent, and they set themselves loose from the Grand Lodge of England. The same thing happened with the lodges that came to America from Spain or from France. They became provincial lodge, but the Grand Lodge of Cuba created this lodge from the. So eventually, these were the lodges that were created. And some from Venezuela, some from Spain, some from Cuba, and finally the Grand Lodge was created in 1885. You can see how many people are in these lodges. Ostos is an educator which is very famous. Betances was the guy who organized the independence Grito de Lara. Santiago Palmer was the first Grand Master of the Grand Lodge. Matienzo Cintron and Luis Belvis were very important politicians and Masons. Ruiz Quiñones was the Grand Secretary. And Muñoz Rivera and Celso Barbosa were two great political leaders. And all of these guys were Masons. Okay, this is De Castro, this is Betances. Okay. In Cuba, you have all of those guys, Del Monte, Montoro, Varona, Cortina, Cabrera, Iberga, Genel. These were all men of letters, men who wrote books, who were journalists, who were writers, poets. In Puerto Rico, the same story. Valdoriotti was Federico de Gateau. Cayetano Colitoste was a historian. Antonio Cordero was a Grand Master. Jose de Diego was a poet. Jose Claudio Vera was a musician. These guys, that's why I call them the century, the golden period of organization. So you have here that all of these guys they were autonomists. They were looking, at that time, they were looking for a self-government just like Canada had from England. They had a government. The Queen could appoint somebody there who could sit there and preside, but there would be a parliament elected by the people. They would have freedom of liberty. Spain never wanted to do that, so they had to do a war of independence and separate. Okay. Juan de Palma was the first president of Cuba. He was a Mason, and all of these guys were. Muñoz Rivera was the father of Muñoz Marin, who was the father of the Puerto Rican ELA, Estado Libre Asociado, Free Commonwealth, Puerto Rico. So, and in the Dominican Republic, so you can see that these guys, they were in the Caribbean. The Freemasonry was very active. It was very inspirational. It created schools. It was a school of leaders. Many of these men, like, for example, this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, who else? This guy, and, this guy, this guy, this guy, and in Cuba, this guy, and this guy, and this guy. They never went to university. these were guys who came from the lower middle class. They went to the lodges, they learned how to speak in the lodges, they learned to read good material in the lodges, they interacted. It had a great value for them. The lodge was a school of leaders. The lodge formed them, not only their souls, but they formed their intellect. And it was extremely important in that sense. So as a summary, there were anecdotal, if any, activity before 1800s, as opposed to the United States, where we do have a very active Freemasonry in the 1700s, especially in the second half of the second decade. The initial impetus for Freemasonry comes from the slave revolution in Haiti, because all the French who were Masons get scattered around Puerto Rico and Cuba, Dominican Republic. They went to the United States, they went to Louisiana, and they took their lodges with them. Okay? Freemasonry in the Caribbean reappears in 1859. There is a big difference between this Freemasonry and this Freemasonry, because Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic were so poor colonies. There was no middle class. You had the aristocrats here and everybody else here. So in the very beginning of the century, there were very few who could afford to become Masons. They didn't have those interests, they didn't have the money, they didn't have the time, they were very busy trying to make it every day. In the 1850s, already a more ample middle class existed. And that's where Freemasonry in the Spanish Caribbean, the autochthonous, we call autochthonous because those are the ones from the Creoles, as opposed to the Spaniards and Europeans. And those autochthonous Freemasons were people from the middle class, some from the more comfortable middle class, and they could go to university, and some of them even travel abroad, like Betances, for example, or the Castro, or others like Palmer and Casar, who were from the lower middle class, and they used the lodges as the place where they fomented their education. Okay, and remember that in the Dominican Republic they had a very different way, because the Dominican Republic was cut from Spain at the very early stage, at the beginning of the 18th century, and it has some sort of a different, even though they did keep in contact with the rest of the Spanish Latin American countries. So I do appreciate very much you guys coming and sharing these things. If you have any questions, I would be very happy to provide some answers if I can.